Dr. Katrina Bell McDonald from Sociology, and I am a faculty member associated with Africana Studies, along with my colleague, Dr. Floyd Hayes, who's here, and a number of familiar faces. We appreciate you coming out tonight to RAP sessions in Africana Studies. This is a seminar series that was begun about 4 years ago under the auspices of one of our postdocs, who's now at Williams College. No, I take that back. This was mine. This was mine. I forgot. We did the other. I didn't. It was my desire 4 or 5 years ago to have a seminar series that really focused on the scholarship of the graduate students. So often undergraduates say to me, what are the graduate students doing actually? I mean, I know I want to go to graduate school, but what do graduate students do actually? So I thought we needed to showcase our graduate students. Particularly to undergraduates, so that undergraduates would have a better, idea of what it is that graduate students are doing, particularly graduate students right here now. So in this series, we have a series of students who are doing work in Africana Studies who are presenting their work. We're very grateful tonight that Mr. Bryan Carter is gracing us from the Political Science Department. He did not like the introduction that I found for him, so he searched the internet far enough and has now handed me the proper introduction. You know what we are? So thank you again, Bryan. Bryan is here from the Political Science Department where he is a doctoral student. He is currently concentrating in American politics and political theory. Generally, his research interests include Black politics, Black political philosophy, democratic theory, and social movements. He is interested in the nature of contemporary Black political regimes in majority Black U.S. cities and the ways in which they mobilize and demobilize Black politics. His present project interrogates recent changes in Baltimore's public housing policies to explore the aforementioned topic. You should know that before he was here at Hopkins, he completed his master's in politics at the New School for Social Research in New York. And he double majored in political science and African American studies at Temple University. And he's done apparently a lot of work around nonprofits and the reform of nonprofits. So we're very grateful to have him in our midst, working hard in the political science department, working toward his PhD, which is coming how soon? Never. Never. It's never going to happen. So we'll just dwell in ABD land with him. But tonight he is our presenter, and we're grateful, and we are also grateful for all of you coming out right before the long Thanksgiving week off. It's nice for us to do this as we culminate. So thank you so much, Bryan.
Thank you, Dr. McDonald. I want to thank the Center for Africana Studies for inviting me to give this talk. And for everyone for coming out, particularly my colleagues and a bunch of my students, which is unsettling.
Yay.
So as I understand rep sessions, I'm supposed to talk about myself.
We'd like to.
Which you know me makes me terribly uncomfortable.
Well, I tried to do the intro stuff to ease.
It's all good. And I'm supposed to talk a little bit about my sort of research interests and my intended trajectory. So as I've planned the actual talk itself, it runs anywhere between about 28 and 32 minutes. What I thought we did was take the first 15 minutes to just kind of do that stuff, maybe answer a few questions should anybody be that interested, and then we'll do the actual talk itself. As far as the talk, this is not a formed or like a finished paper. So basically what I'm presenting is what I personally call, hi Sally, a chunky outline. I don't really know the academic term for that. But basically if I'm being a good grad student, which is very rare, I write in our research as I go, and what I have now is essentially a long outline and sort of paragraphs of thoughts and sort of things that I think are important or that I'm trying to work through, kind of intertwined in between. So this is essentially what you're getting, is sort of that presentation of a paper that I'm working on for a class that I'm taking now, but that I hope becomes something useful in the future, hopefully. So, about me, so I got into politics because of my grandfather, actually. I grew up in South Carolina. Anybody that's had a single parent in their life, they send you away during the summers. They can, be an adult. And I spent this summer in the swamp with my grandparents. And he controlled the television when he was home. He was very rarely home, but he controlled the television. And on this particular year, it was 1992. Some of you weren't alive, that's scary. And the Democratic National Convention was on, so Hawk, who's my grandfather, who never voted a day in his life, decided he's going to watch the convention. Apparently he did it every 4 years. He was really into it, and he was a pretty amazing conspiracy theorist. So he knew who all the black folks were, and he had every kind of, he conjectured every sort of idea about why they would never be president, and you know, how white folks are trying to kill us. So that was my introduction to politics. It was through my grandfather, whom I never even knew had any sort of interest outside of being angry and being a pretty awesome grandfather. And that's how I kind of got involved and got really interested. And for the longest time, I thought I was going to run for office. Even up and through college, I kind of planned Temple around, in part around the idea of running for office in Philadelphia. And quickly dispelled that idea when I became a student activist and got arrested a bunch of times. So it doesn't feel like it was going to work out. And that kind of ended up in La La Land. And I think this, particularly for undergrads, most of us now don't necessarily jump into grad school with the sort of intention of, I'm definitely doing this thing, I know exactly what I want to do with my life, I have a very clear path. There are a select few of us, Melissa, who kind of understand what we're going to do long term, really early on in our lives, and I certainly was not that person. I kind of decided I didn't want to run for office anymore, I didn't really want to go to law school, and I said, okay, let me kind of work in nonprofits. So I did nonprofit work. And anyone that's done nonprofit work, you learn very quickly that nonprofit work sucks because you work as hard as you do with a for-profit job, but you're not getting paid. You work with students. The amount of money that you would get paid with a corporation, and I felt like I wasn't really doing anything that was useful, so I quit the nonprofit thing, and I'm in New York now, so I'm like, okay, let me work for some candidates. And I figured out people who run for office are stupid. And I thought, okay, let me do some activism. And I figured out activists are stupid. And it wasn't necessarily me saying that these people are stupid so much as it wasn't sort of fulfilling the interest that I had. So I literally went to grad school to give myself some time just to think, right? I had no intention of becoming a professor. I had no intention of sort of taking on academia as a potential career. I'm in grad school, like, I'm gonna figure these things out, I'm probably going back home, but I'm just gonna think for a couple of years. And then I met Robin Hayes, and then I met Timothy Patcherat, and then I met Neva Woodley, and these amazing people who think for a living. And I said, holy shit, I wanna do that. Can I curse? I can't curse, I'm sorry. So I thought, oh, I want to do this for a living. I wanted to do it the way that they do it. So this was about 3 years ago, and it took me a little while to get here for a whole host of reasons. But that's how I kind of came into academia. I didn't have a hardcore plan. But I am so far satisfied that I'm here. And it's been sort of a weird trajectory, but I think a useful one, and one that undoubtedly informs my research. About my research, I think I came with the sort of intent of studying elitism and sort of black political participation. I'm just baffled by Mississippi. So if you know anything about Mississippi, Mississippi is nearly 40% black, and people over here. And it's a very red state, right? But they tell us demographics, demographics. So if you have enough black people in one place, and you have enough sort of social liberals and social white liberals in the same place, you're gonna have a pretty good shot in winning statewide office in, you know, a place like any sort of state. And Mississippi just kind of doesn't make sense, right? Nor does Alabama, that's like 30% black. Nor does South Carolina, that's 25% black. And if you look at where black people are, most of them are in the South, right? They're below the Mason-Dixon line still. About 55% of black Americans, particularly those with a history of slavery in their backgrounds, they're in the Southeast, and they're being represented in these really sort of vitriolic ways that are completely the antithesis of what their actual political beliefs are. So I think I kind of came into my research, came into grad school thinking that that was what I was going to do, and then I met some serious political theorists, and now I have no idea, right? So just in the same way that as an undergrad, you kind of come into school and you have a pretty good idea what you want to be when you grow up, so to speak. Coming into grad school, you have a pretty good solid idea of what you want to do, and for a lot of this, it gets blown up, right? So that's not to say that I strayed so far away from my initial interests that they're gone, but they are different, and I haven't quite put them back together in a way that makes sense. Does that sound right?
Sounds good.
Awesome. So this talk. Right now, I am sort of enamored with James Baldwin, and I am enamored with sort of ideas about democratic theory. I am sort of really curious about the ways in which Black people have thought about politics over time, and I'm really interested in sort of disrupting, along with other scholars who do great work, in disrupting this notion of sort of monolithic Black political thought. And I think this is going to be my first potential contribution to it. The way the paper is framed around a rights discourse, and I'm not entirely satisfied with that. I'm doing it because I'm taking a rights class. But I think there's a lot more there, and I think kind of the chunky outline as is sort of.
Can you tell us what the rights class covers?
It's the theories of rights in America. So it's sort of the way in which we think about what I call rights regimes. I think we all sort of articulate our politics in a lot of ways as a set of rights, right? So you have a right to vote, you have a right to use public resources, you have a right to get up and leave this room should you choose, right? So a lot of our politics are articulated in that sort of way, and the class is helping me rather, to think about, to think in a more nuanced way about how we articulate rights and why it matters. So it's not going to be a long-term research interest of mine, but I'm ultimately glad I made progress. So this is me sort of using Baldwin to think through the course, but also using the course to sort of think through Baldwin. And I'll be honest, when I kind of started poking at this stuff, I expected something completely different. And I think a lot of folks who do research will tell you that that happens, and that's probably a good thing. That you kind of walk into your, I think we also walk into our research with a set of hypotheses, and they should get blown up on occasion. Mine certainly did. And I'm glad it did, because now I'm glad it did. So let's get to it. Cool? All right, so this presentation has dual purposes. I'm going to read this entire time for the most part, just while I'm not looking at you. So this presentation has dual purposes. The first is to challenge the ways in which we think about rights, and to trouble the notion that a civil rights regime was the only available political option, or the only desirable political option, to Black political actors during the height of the civil rights movement. The second is to place those divergent ideas in conversation with contemporary Black grassroots political actors actively pursuing changes in American governance. In other words, I want to demonstrate that Black political actors theorized about alternative forms of governance, a different kind of America that reached beyond the fight for racial equality and incorporation in the American regime, as well as think about what those actors who pursued those divergent notions might suggest about our current politics. So one way to think about rights in American politics is and I'm sorry, I wrote this specifically for undergrads, so if I'm insulting your intelligence grad students, I apologize. One way to think about rights in America is the analogy of the onion. If the founding fathers, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and mass indigenous genocide make the core of the American Republic, then rights are part of the many layers that wrap around the onion's core to fill out and occasionally restructure American governance. We extend rights to new citizens, residents, and visitors. We extend rights to previously oppressed peoples. We extend and redefine rights as citizens make new claims about divergent norms, or to reflect a long-lived ignored reality. So for the undergrads in the room, in your lifetimes, The most prominent examples of an extension of new rights are those of marriage equality, right? When you were born, no states explicitly permitted marriage between people of the same gender or for people of fluid genders. Today, 35 of our 50 states do one or both. Rights are one of many ways in which we expand the contours of our republic. However, in recent years, rights have also been a great means by which we retract the contours of our republic. And I think this happens in two ways. The most obvious way is that we narrow the ways in which rights are employed, right? So, Voting Rights Act. Supreme Court nullification of Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act is an excellent example of this. To briefly recap, the Voting Rights Act was passed by Congress in 1965 and reauthorized every 10 years thereafter. The act removed some of the last vestiges of Jim Crow with regards to Black Americans exercising the franchise. It made illegal such barriers as closed primaries, poll taxes, and other technologies of Jim Crow that prevented Blacks from accessing the ballot box. The key part of the Voting Rights Act was Section 4, which developed a coverage formula that determined which municipalities have to seek approval from the Justice Department before instituting new laws and regulations with regards to voting. Basically, if the Texas legislature wanted to change anything about the way in which it conducts elections, it would have to get the okay from the Justice Department before it would be able to implement it. By nullifying Section 4 and removing the formula, it essentially allows states to do as they please with their elections and to limit who gets to vote. Another way in which we use rights to retract the contours of the republic is to successfully make new claims that grant new rights in such a way that limits the rights of others. For example, when the Supreme Court decided in favor of Citizens United and removed most barriers for corporations and interest groups to advertise during election cycles, it narrows the political voice of non-wealthy individuals and organizations who also want to participate. Think of it this way. There are only 24 hours in a day for a television station broadcast, of which about a third is dedicated to advertising. If a corporation with vast resources can afford to purchase 7 hours and 45 minutes of those 8 hours, it only leaves 15 minutes, none of which would likely be in prime time, for the very angry Negro society to potentially reach voters via the airwaves. While the rights of the BANS have not necessarily been revoked, their ability to exercise them has been severely limited. Both of those examples, beyond those examples rather, rights are being outright ignored, right? And for my purposes, the best way to think of this is through terms of like police brutality, right? We have a stated constitutional right that is supposed to protect us from cruel and unusual punishment. It's right there in the 8th Amendment. But I think being choked to death from having potentially sold illegal cigarettes probably violates the 8th Amendment. I think being shot to death for jaywalking and then left in the middle of the street for 4 hours probably violates the 8th Amendment. And while there are remedies for those rights should they be violated, we haven't quite figured out the remedy that brings someone back to life. I make these points because the political, intellectual, and judicial trajectories of Black Americans are centered in a rights discourse. I have the right to vote, I have the right to an equal education, so on and so forth. But as I've demonstrated, rights are at best tenuous when they are not being outright violated. I'm arguing that rights as a protective measure rely primarily on the goodwill of those managing the levers of power. The rights discourse or rights regime offers an important but fickle relief from white supremacy, and that the more intersectionally marginalized a person is, the more capricious the rights are. The rights have their defenders, chief among them critical race theorists. So led by brilliant scholars, including Kimberly, led by brilliant scholars, including Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, and Richard Delgado, the critical race theory movement rose in defense of rights at a time when the efficacy of rights were being challenged on both the left and the right. The neoconservative right criticized the continuous use of rights rhetoric by simply arguing that racism was over, and that we should all turn our attention to other matters, blah, blah, blah. But the left had a more complex critique. I'm thinking specifically of critical legal scholars here. And for the purposes of this presentation, we want to use Kimberly Crenshaw's reading of the CLS movement, which I have some difficulties with, to make my argument. So according to Crenshaw, the left used Gramsci's notion of hegemony, arguing that rights uphold rather than deconstruct inequality in political regimes by reinforcing existing arrangements and convincing the oppressed that their existing order is inevitable. Legal scholar Alan Friedman argues that the legal reforms of the civil rights movement were limited by the ideological constraints embedded within the law, which are grounded in white supremacy, making them repositories for racial domination. For Mark Tushnet, rights caused people to lose sight of their political objectives. For the left generally, rights do little more than convince us that all we have is all there is, and that our only viable option, if we're lucky, is to expand our political potential within the confines of the present system, rather than seeking to overturn it. Thus, for the left, rights, to borrow phrasing from our own Lester Spence, limit the political imagination of the dominated. More than that, because rights insist that we consent to our political regime, Gramsci's hegemony suggests that the oppressed tacitly consent to their own oppression in their advocacy for a rights regime, taking up a stake in the maintenance of their own domination. Rather, the left encourages proponents of rights to focus instead on ideology. Legal scholar Robert Gordon argues that the goal should be to, quote, unfreeze the world as it appears to common sense, as a bunch of more or less objectively determined social relations, and to make it appear as it really is. People acting, imagining, rationalizing, justifying. For the left, people do horrible things, not the law or the absence of rights. We will best be served to turn our attention to why we believe the things that we believe and do the things that we do. Only then can we disrupt political, social, and cultural domination. That's really interesting. What did you do? Okay. But I needed the break, so all right. However, Crenshaw urges us to pump the brakes. While she concedes that rights are not the end-all and be-all, and that critical legal scholars offer useful critiques and analysis, she insists that a rights regime is absolutely necessary, and that what is left missing from their analysis is the most important factor in the dismissal of rights, the mechanisms of racial domination in American governance. Crenshaw states, quote, the failure of critics of rights to incorporate racism into their analysis also renders their critiques of rights and their overall analysis of law in America incomplete, which leads to an inability to fully appreciate the transformative significance of the civil rights movement in mobilizing Black Americans and generating new demands. Simply stated, racism matters and it doesn't work the way the left suggests. For Crenshaw, racism legitimates Black subordination and oppression, hence making what people believe about Blacks more important than what Blacks believe about themselves. This disrupts the CLS notion of hegemony. Moreover, Crenshaw argues, and I think appropriately so, that Blacks never consented to racial domination, right? So to quote Malcolm X, Plymouth Rock landed on us. In fact, rights are crucial to Black political aspiration in a racist world that conspires against them, and as it, quote, remains receptive to some aspirations that are central to Black demands, and may also perform an important function in combating the experience of being excluded and oppressed. For Crenshaw, the left is proposing a set of critiques that dissolves the rights regime and leaves nothing in its place, essentially leaving white supremacy untouched. For Crenshaw, shifting ideology necessitates legitimation, which must be done within the confines of the institutionally determined logic. Thus, Crenshaw is providing a narrative that suggests that Blacks did not have any other realistic options during the civil rights movement. To operate from the outside, which suggests a different framework, would have been absolute alienation. Hence, the political actors of the civil rights movement chose their only viable political option, which was advancing the political incorporation of Blacks into the dominant white society. So while Crenshaw presents a powerful argument, I don't think that her narrative on political options is correct. Even during the height of the civil rights movement, when Black political actors were on the verge of major legislative victories, they were also considering other options, including vastly different forms of American democracy that question the efficacy of rights and abandon rights as a regime altogether. I view James Baldwin, widely considered one of the most thoughtful theorists on questions of race in America, particularly during the civil rights movement, as one of the aforementioned. I'm using Baldwin here for two reasons. Actually, I'm using him for 3 reasons. I need an excuse to read Baldwin. So the first reason is that Baldwin is writing some of his most heralded essays during the period of Crenshaw, during the period that Crenshaw suggests black political actors had very few viable political options. Second, though Baldwin actively organized to pass the Civil and Voting Rights Act, he also questions them and offers a different kind of democratic theory, the one reliant on a rights regime, one that I think reflects the ethos of communitarianism. What is communitarianism? Very briefly and very crudely, communitarianism is a philosophy that emphasizes, as the title suggests, the community. Communitarianism rejects notions of individuality and argues that individuals should be well integrated into communities where they are better able to reason and act responsibly, more so than they would be in isolation. Kind of trying to use force, how crazy I'm having. In communitarian theory, you don't need rights because the good of all individuals reflects the good of the group. So for example, guided by a communitarian ethos, Dr. McDonald would never shoot off my pinky toe. I'm a big guy, I need my pinky toe to get around, and I'm not as mobile as I otherwise would be, and I can't support the community to the best of my ability without my pinky toe. Accordingly, by shooting my pinky toe off, Dr. McDonald not only hurts me, but she hurts herself by hurting the community. In this way, I think Baldwin challenges the needs of a rights regime and strongly articulates the critical legal studies argument that Americans must focus on shifting ideology before becoming consumed with establishing a new set of rights. Now, my reading of Baldwin runs counter to other popular readings of Baldwin, including my own, most notably Lori Balfour. Balfour contends that Baldwin's democratic practice is one of illumination. For Balfour, by using his personal narrative, Baldwin shines a light on the space between democratic ideas of America and actual American political practice. So Balfour argues that because of his preoccupation, Balfour argues that because of his preoccupation with personal transformation, that Baldwin never bothers to construct a theory of the just society, that he, quote, has relatively little to say about specific political institutions and offers no systematic analysis of the economic injustices he describes so vividly. And I just find it hilarious that the theorist is criticizing anyone for not talking about institutions. Rather, Baldwin develops a notion of acceptance and that he uses, that he uses to mine the gulf between the myth of America and the American lived experience. Moreover, while Balfour acknowledges Baldwin's rage and his legitimation of black race generally, she suggests that he rejects romantic notions of revolution. For Balfour, Baldwin is a pragmatic visionary, one that recognizes the historic failures of America and the ways in which those failures are presently manifesting, but who does not present a vision of the future that would disrupt the system entirely. While I agree with Balfour's argument that a central part of Baldwin's political project was to reveal the gulf between America in theory, quote, burn the house down. While I envision my larger project as a much more nuanced project in making greater use of Baldwin's written work, as well as his speeches, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm limiting my analysis to two pieces. His book of essays, The Fire Next Time, which was published in book form in 1963, and his debate with conservative icon William F. Buckley at Cambridge University in 1965. So before I begin, I want to make a couple of things clear. I want to make it clear that I'm not outright calling Baldwin a communitarian. That's just crazy. And I haven't done enough research to actually make that claim. I'm only arguing that in these specific pieces, Baldwin's democratic theory has a communitarian ethos that rejects the necessity of a rights regime and promotes ideological shifts, which I think Balfour misses. So when I use the phrase Baldwin's communitarianism or any derivative thereof, please understand with that caveat. Also, I'm not advocating communitarianism as a sort of practical political practice. It's not my politics per se, but this is just what I kind of see possible, what could possibly be written in Baldwin's work. Baldwin articulates a communitarian ethos in three ways. First, for Baldwin, black life and politics are inextricably tied to the American political project. Baldwin rejects the idea of blacks creating a new state and economy completely separate from America that would purportedly alleviate white supremacy. Baldwin identifies this as an anti-colonial project for blacks in the diaspora, but not a reasonable solution for blacks in America. He argues that even black separatist movements, for him embodied by Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, are too deeply rooted in American economics and politics to be extricated from the American political experiment. While Baldwin is personally wooed by Elijah Muhammad in Baldwin's mind to join Muhammad's movement, he was intrigued by the romantic notion of separatism and understood the rhetorical power that it held for blacks in America. Quote, God is black, all black men belong to Islam, they have been chosen. This sweet possibility that thousands of oppressed black men and women in this country now carry with them, as the Muslim minister has spoken, through the dark, noisome, ghetto streets, into the hovels where so many have perished. The white God has not delivered them, perhaps the black God will. But Baldwin essentially argues that this is a fantasy, that the evidence ushered forward by Muhammad in the nation is dependent on very American notions of wealth and power. Moreover, even if Muslims were able to appropriate land from the United States as payback for black enslavement, a suggestion at the time, whilst to surely take the wealth with them, that blacks would be marooned on an island of hostility with few resources at their disposal to protect themselves and to build a black nation. While the spiritual prowess of the nation is attractive and the intention to strengthen the black community is admirable, Baldwin ultimately acknowledges that even for the nation, black progress is tied to American values. This is in part spurred by Baldwin's insistence that we all acknowledge black Americans, and as central to the formation of the American state. Quote, I am not a ward of American, Baldwin argues, I am one of the first Americans to arrive on these shores. Baldwin is deeply troubled, and this is a persistent theme in his work, by the idea that blacks have to be admitted into the American Union, that they are not readily considered part and parcel of the American political experiment, whatever its failures. Quote, one has been here since, if one has got to prove one's title to the land, isn't 400 years enough? 400 years of these 3 wars, the American soil is full of the corpses of my ancestors. Why is my freedom or my citizenship or my right to live there, how is it conceivably a question now? Baldwin is insisting that we reframe the debate on white supremacy in America. Blacks are not aliens in a foreign land any more than they are leeches come to sustain ourselves in the wealth of others, or conquerors come to take said wealth by force. For Baldwin, blacks are the physical product of the American political, economic, and social experiments. We are no less American than our white counterparts and owe the least equitable access to resources and opportunities afforded them. There's no need for a new home, we've been home all along. Quote, the black and white deeply need each other here if we are really to become a nation, to achieve our identity, our maturity, to create one nation that has proved to be a hideously difficult task. There is certainly no need now to create 2, one black and one white. Baldwin goes further, arguing that the poorest and the most disenfranchised blacks among us are in fact the American royalty, or in his words, the improbable aristocrats, the quote, only genuine aristocrats this country has produced. He highlights the ways in which blacks pocketed their pride and undertook menial, sometimes dehumanizing work so that their children and by proxy America might survive. These improbable aristocrats, in so much as one might, have earned equitable treatment in the communitarian sense because they are the primary contributors to the American Republic. Black Americans, by building the nation, have done and are actively doing their part to support the community to keep it thriving. Quote, from a very literal point of view, the harbors, the ports, the railroads of this country, the economy, especially in the southern states, could not conceivably be what it has become if they had not had what they had and if they had not had and do still have cheap labor. I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, that I picked the cotton, that I carried it to the market, that I built the railroads under someone else's whip for nothing. The Southern oligarchy was created by my labor and my sweat, and the violation of my woman, and the murder of my children. What's missing by Baldwin's account is not a new set of civil rights. Rather, Baldwin is arguing that white Americans are failing in their duty as communitarians to equitably contribute to the survival and upkeep of the community. They are certainly profiting from the community. They certainly survive on the community's labor, but they are not equal laborers, and if blacks are to become equal, they must share more equitably in the wealth and the labor that makes it. Second, Baldwin argues that you can't trust a rights regime, specifically the idea that blacks can be given a set of political rights. Quote, white Americans are nothing more than deluded in supposing that Negroes could ever have imagined that white people can give them anything. Here's another area where, returning to the onion analogy, I question Baldwin's commitment to layering on new rights. Baldwin believes that rights aren't even available for whites or the American state to give. He speaks of commitment and sacrifice, that the idea to extend that in order to extend rights, one has to give themselves. He asserts that white Americans have never demonstrated their ability to do so en masse, and that failure, returning again to the communitarian idea, is the central failure of the American democracy. Moreover, Baldwin outright questions the efficacy of rights. We have a civil rights, I'm quoting now, we have a civil rights bill now, we have an amendment, he's giving this speech in 1975. We have a civil rights bill now, we have an amendment, the 15th Amendment, nearly 100 years ago. If the amendment was not honored then, I don't have any reason to believe that the civil rights bill will be honored now. This returns us to my much earlier point, using the example of police brutality, that America has outright ignored civil rights and the protections that they're meant to provide. Under conditions of such violence, where blacks are left bare to the world, unshielded by the protection of the state, even under such circumstances where they're supposed to have said protection, why would blacks reasonably return to a rights regime to develop a new set of protections? Like the critical legal scholars, Baldwin is insisting that ideological changes in the ways in which we see blacks, the ways in which we see whites, and the ways in which we see America are critical, and the only means by which blacks might find some measure of equality. Quoting, "The moral lives of white Americans have been destroyed by the plague called color. The American sense of reality has been corrupted by it." This brings me to my final point. Baldwin makes a biopolitical argument against rights that, in biblical terms, resituates black interests and white interests, not as Moses and the Egyptians fighting against Pharaoh, but as Cain killing Abel. He does this by articulating the notion of countrymen and the notion of love. And please forgive me, but parts of this is going to have me sounding like Cornel West. Baldwin uses the systematic rape of black women during enslavement to demonstrate that blacks and whites share a common heritage, and argues that said common heritage is what we use to bind black and white political interests. Quote, "One watches these lonely people deny the only kin they have. We talk about integration in America as if it is some great new conundrum. The problem in America is that we've been integrated for a very long time. Put me next to any African and I will show you what I mean. And my grandmother was not a rapist." Where black politics has traditionally rooted linked fate between people of shared racial heritage, Baldwin is both extending and disrupting that. For Baldwin, African enslavement forged a new nation, a new society, and a new people. The linked fate is not between blacks in the Caribbean and black African peers. For Baldwin, at least with regards to this particular argument, the linked fate is between blacks and whites in America, with a shared history of enslavement. Baldwin often repeats the phrase countrymen, insinuating that in the same way that the Irish would commune with other Irish, or that the French would commune with other French, black and white Americans commune, or should commune, with one another the same way. Quote, "White Americans are my countrymen, and I do care about them. And even if I didn't, there is something between us. We have the same shorthand. I know when I look at a girl or a boy from Tennessee, where they came from in Tennessee and what that means. No Englishman knows that, no Frenchman knows that. No one in the world knows it except another black man that comes from the same place." If we are to take this communitarian ethos seriously, Baldwin is suggesting an ideological shift, as also suggested by critical legal scholars. For Baldwin, this reframing of American racism to one of a shared fight, an expanded political community that recognizes the collective states that whites also have, and alleviating the oppression of blacks, is absolutely vital if one seriously wishes to jettison white supremacy. Being given a new set of rights is not enough. Being treated with equality is not enough. Whites and blacks have to come together to see one another as each other. So with this view, we can understand better how Baldwin and why Baldwin's popularity fell so precipitously with the rise of the Black Power movement. In his use of the concept of love, Baldwin goes further. He does not employ love in the romantic sense or in the personal sense. I would also argue that he absolutely does not do it in the vein of Cornel West, who provides an incredibly romantic vision of the civil rights movement. Rather, for Baldwin, love is about the, quote, tough and universal sense of quest and daring and growth. For Baldwin, this growth would, at least in some ways, ameliorate what he sees as the ugly fear that whites have projected onto blacks. Said fear is what necessitates a new set of rights to protect blacks from individual rights and from the state. Baldwin's notion of love is not just an expansion of the way in which we see one another, or a broader acceptance of the humanity of different people. Rather, Baldwin's love is about personal growth in such a way that builds bonds, biological bonds, between the oppressor and the oppressed. The bonds are what constitute the contours of a shared community, and what will prevent the harm between blacks and whites, as again, returning to the example of Dr. McDonald shooting off my pinky toe, to harm one person would mean to harm oneself. Going further, love would not just build bonds, but it would also blacken whiteness. Quote, the only way the white man can be released from the Negro's tyrannical power over him is to consent, in effect, to become black himself, to become a part of that suffering. He now watches wistfully from the heights of his lonely power. How can one respect, let alone adopt the values of the people who do not on any level live the way that they say they do, or the way they say they should? It should be clear that Baldwin envisions this as a one-way street. He is not in any way advocating for blacks to assimilate into whiteness. On the contrary, Baldwin sees blacks as a true and probable aristocracy, the backbone of America. This is really American chauvinism reading this. He believes that whatever success America has had is due almost entirely to the labor and subjugation of blacks in America. So for Baldwin, it's not whites that need to invite blacks to the club. It's the absolute inverse. Blacks need to open themselves and their hearts up to accepting whites. Like Balfour, I also read Baldwin's notion of acceptance as accepting the limitations of the American democracy and shedding light on the gulf between what we say we are and who we actually are. For Baldwin, whites need to traverse their own struggle, their own metaphorical middle passage, and come into the community willing to work hand in hand with blacks to build a community that recognizes the full humanity of everyone. Quote, it's a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them, until the moment comes when we, the Americans, the American people, are able to accept that fact, that my ancestors are both white and black, that on the continent that we are trying to forge a new identity, one for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America, I am not an object of missionary charity, I am one of the people who built this country. Until that moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it. So what does all this mean for today? I will be absolutely honest. So when I started kind of along this topic, I was thinking this book would give me some way of thinking about how we might think about Ferguson, how we might think about Moral Mondays in North Carolina, how we might think about the Dream Defenders, how we might just think about just sort of new politics in general. And I made a really big assumption, and I shouldn't have, right? But I do think, and I'm sorry, I made that assumption based upon the two texts that I'm actually working with. I do think that Baldwin does offer a sort of set of conditions under which we might consider an absolute revolution, right? But he doesn't lay it bare in a certain way. He just says that that sort of move is possible. Does anyone who's not a grad student know where the title, The Fire Next Time, comes from? So he's quoting an old slave spiritual. And the line goes, God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time, right? So what I want to do as far as this project going forward is figure out exactly how that spiritual was used during enslavement to give signals, and to argue and to think about whether or not Baldwin is giving us a sort of go pass, right? Like, and in some ways I think he's arguing that we only have one sort of guaranteed political maneuver, right? That blacks can destroy this American experiment at any time if they get ready, right? That's our playing card. But we have to be strategic about when we use it. And I think maybe he might be suggesting some ways in which we might think about that. I'm not sure. I haven't done a deep enough reading of the stuff I presented and I have to read again his stuff more broadly to come to that. But I think this is a good place to start talking about what all of this means, crazy, and what stakes this might have for our current set of political challenges. So that's my talk. Thanks, guys.
Well, that is excellent. And I, along with many others, I'm sure we're very interested in knowing what reactions you all have to what was said. So
It's too many Thursday.
feel free to jump in.
Can you say your name when you say?
Oh yeah, I'm Jessa. I'm a freshman.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Yeah, so I found it really interesting. Like, I feel like most of the stuff I've learned about has been kind of simplified. Like, the only option is definitely all that I was like taught in school about. So I definitely found that interesting. I can ask a question, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was a little confused when you started talking about reframing racism so that like Black and white people see each other as each other, and I don't know, it seemed like a little bit like colorblindness rhetoric, which I think of as like a bad thing. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit maybe.
Yeah, I'm troubled by it too, right? And so I think for me, I'm someone that read and listened to Baldwin super romantically. Like, I was just kind of swept into the aura of kind of this rhetoric. But I think what you're plucking on is real, right? So do I think that Baldwin is suggesting that we should build and lead to some sort of colorblind society? Absolutely not. But I do think that he's suggesting that part of our rationale for getting along and for treating each other well is that we have the same fathers, right? Like, within my lineage, within my heritage, there is a slaver that raped some Black woman, and that's part of how I got here, right? But because we have that shared heritage, we should kind of come to terms with it and use that as a means of kind of building these wider bonds. I don't know how I feel about that, right? And I hate the notion of communitarianism as a sort of viable political option or a viable democratic theory generally. It's not, these aren't my politics. So part of the project that I'm doing is just to suggest that, or just to demonstrate that we are thinking about this in different ways, that it wasn't just, civil rights, everyone's happy with that. But yeah, I'm troubled by that too. I think that's a astute observation. No, Chris, you can't answer a question.
I'm going to ask a question.
Undergraduate space. Undergraduate.
No,
that question.
I'm just messing with whoever.
Is your question related?
There's a question at the table.
It is related to what's
If you go ahead.
Okay. So this is related to Jess's question. So James Baldwin had said something about like it's on us, or I use that quote, something about that, like when he was talking about when he was talking about Blacks and whites need to like unite together almost.
Yeah. Are you asking what the quote was?
I'm asking like, did he mean like Blacks should like accept whites into their? Okay,
Yeah.
so my question with that is that, like, I understand Baldwin had spent some time outside the U.S., but like, I'm pretty sure that racism wasn't just that Black people didn't want to be around whites. Like, did he understand the whole power dynamic of racism?
I think he did.
Did he just ignore that? Or?
No, I think he did. I just think he's offering this really weird, nuanced sort of partial solution to it, right? Like, it's so I think for him, what he argued, because he's writing these things, and I didn't make this explicitly clear, but he's writing these things at the same time that he's actively organizing and promoting the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Right? He's super involved in the movement. He has relationships with all the leaders that we love. Right? So it's these two sort of kind of dichotomous types of things. Do I think James? So your question is, do I think James Baldwin understood sort of systematic racism, power dynamics? Yes. Right. Do I think that you're right to kind of identify